We're still waiting. Hello, good morning. Bonjour, hola. We're going to wait for a few seconds for all participants to come in. So as we have quite a lot of people registered, I think it's more than 300, so it may take some time. Donc, étant donné le nombre de personnes enregistrées, ça pourrait prendre un peu de temps. Just, I will give you a few instructions, guidelines, technical guidelines, just to begin with. We are asking you to unmute, first of all. Donc, quand vous ne parlez pas, fermez le microphone. Une autre chose, we have interpretation services. Donc, il y a des services d'interprétation. Servicios de interpretación están disponibles. Please, if you want to change the language, you just click on interpretation, which is an icon at the bottom of the screen. So if you click on interpretation, you will see the three languages, English, French, or Spanish. Just click on the one you prefer to listen to. So this is for interpretation. Donc, pour l'interprétation vers le français, interprétation hacia l'espagnol, donc cliquez sur l'icône qui est située en bas de l'écran, interprétation, qui se trouve donc en bas et vous choisissez donc votre langue. Voilà, je crois que de mon côté, ce sont les instructions principales. Donc, quand vous ne, donc on vous demande donc de garder votre microphone éteint, unmute, please, when during the webinar. And thank you all for your participation. I will now give the floor to our moderator, Marcela Villarreal, Director of the Partnerships and United Nations Collaboration Division in FAO.
Thank you very much indeed, Christiane. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. So good morning, actually good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. And we do have people from Australia today. So good morning, welcome to all of you around the world. A very warm welcome to the launch event of the Community Engagement Days. Community Engagement Days is a series of webinars organized by the Dimitra Club's team of the Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equity Division of FAO in collaboration with the Belgian Development Corporation. I would also take the opportunity to also give special warm thanks for their support to the resource partners in the Flexible Multi-Partner Mechanism, better known as FMM to some of us, of which, of course, Belgium is a part, as well as Sweden, France, Ireland, and others. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Adriano Campolina, Benjamin Davis, and also Maximo Torero for their support. So the Community Engagement Days are a total of 5 webinars that will take place from now, February, until June. And they will bring together field practitioners and researchers who are using community engagement for empowerment approaches in their programs and strategies. These webinars aim to take stock and shed light on various approaches and experiences that have to be participatory and people-centered. Today, we will be hosting the first of these webinars, and it launches the series of these community engagement days. So it will be followed by 4 other webinars on different issues that include community engagement and gender equality. This one is going to be on the 11th of March, resilience, monitoring and evaluation, and collective action. For today, we do have an exceptional lineup of speakers. And after the presentations, you will have an opportunity to actually engage with these speakers. There will be a question and answer session. I would like all of you to be patient and wait for the question and answer question. For those of you who would like to ask your questions directly, if we have time for that. But also in the meantime, you can also use the chat box. So use the chat box to ask questions. If they're directed to one specific presenter, please say so. And also, in the meantime, those presenters may also wish to answer already in writing in the chat box. So I believe that the impressive turnout today is this amazing amount of people following us from different parts of the world is a great testimony of the interest in these approaches and the desire to go deeper into them, to learn more about them. And today, let me turn now to the Chief Economist of FAO, who will give us some welcoming remarks. The Chief Economist, Máximo Torero. We do not have the audio. I know we tested before and it was working, so I'm sure that we can have it on.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to join you at the launch of the event of the Community Engagement Days, which is a series of webinars organized by the Inclusive Rural Transformation and Gender Equity Division in collaboration with the Belgian Development Corporation. As you know, we are living today in an unprecedented time with extraordinary challenges resulting from uneven economic growth, persisting poverty, conflicts, climate change, health emergencies, and pervasive gender and other social inequalities. Inequality is a big problem, a big structural challenge that we need to change. There is no way we are going to achieve sustainably SDG 1 and SDG 2 if we don't touch and reduce inequalities. These persistent challenges are clear demonstration that the ongoing processes of rural transformation need to become more inclusive and equitable to enable rural people, particularly the most vulnerable, to capitalize on changes and opportunities rather than to be further marginalized by them. And COVID-19 is increasing these inequalities today. In order to be inclusive, rural transformation must be a bottom-up, participatory, and people-centered process that benefits the entire rural society, men, women, indigenous people, and youth, without discrimination of any kind, enabling all, including marginalized groups, to exercise their socioeconomic rights, develop their abilities, and take advantage of the development opportunities. Against this challenging environment, we hold the conviction that community engagement for empowerment approaches are needed to advance transformational changes, secure the livelihoods and well-being of the poorest, and play a key role in inclusive rural transformation and resilience building. For this to occur, principles such as participation, empowerment, and inclusion need to be embedded in all strategies and policies and at all levels. The Action Track 4 of the World Summit on Food Systems on Advancing Equitable Livelihoods and Value Distribution is a key pathway in this direction. It stresses the importance of building agency of marginalized groups such as youth, the elderly, and the disabled and seasonal migrant or low-wage workers, including in fragile or vulnerable food value chains, who lack the space or the enabling environment in which to exercise their rights. Achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development calls for leaving no one behind by addressing inequality as one of the root causes of poverty in all its forms: inequality in access to economic opportunity, gender inequality, and inequality in access to productive resources and services that restrict the advancements of equitable livelihoods. If females, indigenous people don't have access to assets, there is no way we can move them out of the situations that they are facing and out of the disadvantages they are facing today. Moreover, community engagement approaches are embedded in the strategic priority 1 of the COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan of the United Nations, as well as the current global efforts of humanitarian assistance, including the Grand Bargain, which calls for a coordinated approach for community engagement and participation. Hence, today's timely webinar sets out a compelling case to analyze the value and the relevance of adopting community engagement for empowerment approaches by critically analyzing the achievements, potential, and challenges based on shared experiences and practical lessons learned from the field. We need to learn from experiences that has worked, We need to learn from best practices so that we can make a change and be effective in the way we make the change. Thank you again, and I wish you a fruitful discussions, and I hope we can come up with concrete action plans so that we can walk the talk and make the differences that we need. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Máximo Torero, Chief Economist of FAO. Et maintenant, j'ai le plaisir de donner la parole à son Excellence Franck Caruet, ambassadeur.
To His Excellency Frank Caruet, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Belgium to the United Nations Rome-based agencies. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real honor for Belgium to be involved in this event, whose themes are in line with Belgium's development cooperation policy. Belgium's cooperation policy is based on two main pillars: sustainable and inclusive economic growth and a human rights-based approach. The aim is to contribute to the achievement of SDG 2, namely eradicating hunger, improving nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. Belgium has built a sturdy and long-standing partnership in these domains with FAO, both within its regular budget and through multi-donor funds. We're pleased to see, thanks to these webinars, that FAO shares with Belgium the concern of leaving no one out, as well as its commitment to using participatory and inclusive approaches as a way of supporting the rights of the poorest. And as you know, the poorest in rural areas are usually women. Indeed, rural women are often isolated, marginalized, and left out of large-scale projects and programs because they are often illiterate, invisible, powerless, and voiceless. Rural women, however, are a cornerstone of food security for households and communities and deserve all our attention and respect. This is why the Belgian Cooperation Development supports innovative and participatory projects such as Dimitra clubs, which aim to place populations, especially the most disadvantaged populations, at the heart of development, while involving men, because changes in behavior and outlook must come about with the support and also in the minds of all members of the community. This is a good recipe for achieving sustainable results, because these groups are committed for the benefit of their community, and having no one but themselves on whom to rely, will work towards sustainable development. The results obtained by populations who implement projects themselves have been remarkable and have been replicated. Their willingness to engage in dialogue with their neighbors to maintain social cohesion and peace, their decision to act collectively to build a new future together, is a result of deep and solidarity-based engagement. These successful experiences, witnessed by our embassies and cooperation offices on the ground, are often based on trust and come from having listened to the needs of these populations as perceived and expressed by the populations themselves. I have no doubt that this series of webinars will lend new credibility to people-based approaches for sustainability-centered development. I would like, in concluding, to thank FAO, our partner, for having allowed us to take part in organizing this series of webinars. Thank you very much, Madam.
Merci, merci.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for being here and for Belgium's support throughout the Dimitra Club process. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to invite the Secretary General of the Ministry of Agriculture of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mr. Évariste Bouchabou-Bopeming, to take the floor. You have the floor, sir. Thank you, Madam, for giving me the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to be able to join you here today to launch this series of five webinars on community engagement for empowerment. My participation in this series is all the more fitting since FAO is one of the key partners of the Ministry of Agriculture of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that we work together and share the same goals, namely eradicating hunger, fighting food insecurity, and combating poverty. We feel that today's theme, community engagement for empowerment, is of real importance for a country like ours, with its vast area and the fact that most of the population lives in rural areas. Indeed, given its size, the populations that live in remote areas with limited access are often cut off from vital information and communication methods. Also, despite the importance that the state attaches to rural populations, it cannot, unfortunately, be present everywhere with the same effectiveness. This is one of the reasons for which the Ministry of Agriculture places a particular focus on participatory approaches and on community engagement, so that communities can improve their own living conditions and lives in general. These approaches give communities the ability to come together, to decide and take action collectively, so as to help state agents do effective, pertinent work by conveying to them their needs and finding, to the extent possible, solutions from the bottom up. These approaches are borne out by the many farmer field schools that took off in 2002 in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the support of FAO, so as to allow for development and uptake by farmers of different technologies. In 2002, the main issue that needed to be resolved had to do with the cassava crop, a staple food for over 70% of Congo's population. I would also like to mention the Dimitra clubs, which were also put in place in my country for the first time by FAO in 2006. These clubs provide an inclusive forum for dialogue and for decision-making, and why not also for collective action. All members of the community are invited to take part in these clubs, and women in particular, as well as youth, they are called on to act together through economic, social, and political activities to have an impact on their own lives, their livelihoods, and their communities. Another aim of these clubs is to fight discrimination and violence, especially against women. These community engagement and women's empowerment approaches will be of great use when it comes to implementing the 2021 agenda of His Excellency, President of the Republic, President Tshisekedi, as tabled during the 34th session of the African Union Summit of the 7th of February. The agenda, of course, addresses the COVID-19 crisis and ways to tackle the crisis, as well as promoting peace and security on the African continent. The agenda also covers climate change and a significant investment in human capital, as well as strengthening women's and youth's empowerment. There is no doubt that the agenda covers all the challenges that we face, and that community engagement will play a key role in achieving a more equitable and effective rural development. Thank you very much for having allowed me to speak before this August audience on behalf of DR Congo. Thank you.
Merci, merci.
Thank you, Secretary General of the Agriculture Ministry. It has been an honor to have you here today.
I'd like to introduce Professor Robert Chambers. Professor Robert Chambers is a research associate of the Institute of Development Studies of the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. And I believe he really needs no introduction among people who are following him today. Before he will make his presentation, he would like to share with us two polling questions. So may I ask the questions to be put up? Thank you. So the questions are, have you ever been in a rural village in a developing country in the last 2 years? Please ask yes or no. Answer yes or no. And the second one, have you spent one night in a rural village in a developing country in the last 2 years? We see very quickly the results coming up. I will allow you just a couple of seconds more for people to have the opportunity to respond. Please do not respond non-applicable. And we see the results coming out quite clearly. So we see that around 3/4 of people have been in a rural village in a developing country in the last 2 years, and that 60% of them, less but still an important number, have actually spent a night in a rural village in a developing country in the last 2 years. So now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Chambers. You have the floor.
Well, thank you. I seem to have been rechristened Andrea, but I think you can tell that I'm not, in spite of my long hair, I'm not a woman. I'm or a man. But I'm trying to get rid of something in the middle of my screen. I don't know what it's doing hanging around here.
There is on the top, you will find a little cross that becomes red when you go over it. You would want to just eliminate that, Professor.
Oh, it's worked. Good. I may have got genders confused in what my earlier remarks. It's a tremendous pleasure and an honor, and it's really also rather daunting to be asked to introduce this series. I'd like to start by just saying that I find it very exciting. I think it's very bold, imaginative, and frontier stuff that FAO and this group within FAO are taking this initiative, and that there's so much interest around the world. Quite extraordinary, a lot of people signing up. So greetings to all of you. I wanted to call my talk Community Engagement for Empowerment, which is the label, and then I was going to call it Responsible Realism. And then I thought, I don't know whether I have the courage to call it revolutionary realism, or whether we just have to stick with responsible. So you can make your own judgment. It might be irresponsible. And what I'm going to say falls into four main headings and points, themes. The first one is about critical reflection, sometimes called reflexivity, which is looking in a mirror at oneself. The second one is ground truthing, being in touch and up to date with what's really happening, realistically happening. And then the third one is attitude and behavior change. That's ours. And the final one is practical actions. So what? Arising out of all this. And I want to qualify everything that I say that with the recognition that subsequent presentations by contributors to this series are going to inform all of us a great deal about what is actually happening. So let me start with reflexivity or critical self-reflection. The word community and the word empowerment are both quite problematical. The word community is sometimes, in fact, often used to gloss over the great differences in power, influence, visibility, wealth within communities. Community is useful and it's important as a category, but it is very important, in my view, to be always aware of the fact that there is a thing called elite capture, that the more powerful and influential and more visible people within a community may be the ones with whom there is contact and with whom there is engagement, neglecting and overlooking many of the others. Then the word empowerment is thrown around a lot by all of us. But always there are the who's questions, which I would urge should always be asked whenever empowerment is mentioned. Whose empowerment? And who perhaps is disempowered? Who takes part, who doesn't take part? Who analyzes, who doesn't analyze? Whose theory of change? Oh yes, the theory of change of poor people or discriminated, marginalized people within the community, or at the other extreme, are reality. And then there's the word engagement, which also links with that. Whose engagement? And running through all this is the question, whose reality counts? And the thought that, as a sort of catchy generalization, not always true, of course, but very largely true, all power deceives. All power deceives. In other words, if you're powerful, if you're an upper and other people are lowers, if you're a visitor to a village, for instance, the very fact that you are relatively powerful, and powerful particularly if you're bringing or potentially bringing good things and benefits to the community or to individuals, you're liable to be deceived. In fact, it's a part of everyday life that we deceive one another when we're in upper-lower relationships. So that was the reflexivity, the idea of holding up a mirror to oneself and to seeing what we see, what we understand, how we categorize things, and what we miss. That brings me to my second heading, which is ground truthing. And this is struggling to be in touch and up to date and finding better ways of doing that. And I think other contributors to this series will have good insights to give us about this. In the past couple of years, for instance, I think there have been radical and rapid changes in the lives of many people, in poor communities. And it was encouraging to me, very encouraging to me, to see the result of the poll, that so many of you who are taking part in this, so many of you have not just visited villages, that was about 3/4, I think, but also have spent a night in the village, because that form of immersion, it's an aspect of participation, is a very, very good way of getting beyond the superficial diplomatic treatment that many of us are vulnerable to, and I guess particularly visitors from FAO are vulnerable to, because they're thought to be powerful and important and potential sources of funds or other benefits for the community. So being aware of biases, there are the biases of rural development tourism, which is the visit, which so many of you have done, the visit, and usually it's a one-day visit. Not always, but very often it's a one-day visit from a city or a capital of some sort. And it has biases built into it, which steer us away from meeting or learning from the poorer people. There are spatial biases, tarmac roads and so on, coming out of the capital city. There are seasonal biases, tending not to go in the rains. There are personal biases in who we meet and who we see, the head of the village and so on, and who we don't see. There are biases to going to places where there's some sort of project. There's the bias of politeness and the bias of security, not going to insecure areas. So these are all excluded from our perceptions. And many towns and cities are like a sort of mainland surrounded by an archipelago of communities or villages which are visited and which form the impressions of the people, ourselves, who are based elsewhere. And then we talk to one another, but actually we've been to the same, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you've been taken to the same place that other people have been taken to. And then you share your views of what's happening in rural development with the others. And then you realize that actually you went to the same village. You were taken there. So that's about ground truthing and being in touch and up to date, because change seems to be accelerating. And it's very widely held, because I've been asking again and again in workshops, that for poor people, change in the conditions they experience and in their awareness and aspirations has been accelerating in the last few years. And of course, with COVID, this is even more dramatic than it was beforehand, but it was happening anyway. So this brings me to the third of these headings, which is about attitudes and behavior. And this is our attitudes and behavior. It's not theirs, it's ours, as being problematic, because we're in a position to behave in ways which are facilitating, which are empowering, which particularly emphasize listening and emphasize facilitating. So often starting processes and then standing back. And it's very striking to me that both in integrated pest management and in the reflect approach, which I expect David Archer will be mentioning, in both of those, perhaps the most important thing of all is training and facilitating facilitators, who then become people who start processes, they convene, they start processes, and then they stand back, and the processes take over, and people do their own analysis, which then can be supported from outside if necessary, but very often their own analysis for helping themselves. And this all fits in, this attitude and behavior change. It fits in with with Gandhi's famous remark, which is misquoted and quoted in different ways, but it's basically, we must become the change we wish to see in the world. And this brings me to the fourth heading, which is about practical actions. All right, supposing you accept that there's some sense in what I've just been saying. Of course, you may not, in which case, let's have a good discussion and conversation about it. But the practical actions are more and more to engage in critical reflection about one's own behavior, the effect this has on other people, reflection on their reality and their aspirations, and perhaps applying, as I have done, to empowerment and to community, the same approach to the word engagement, because engagement can take many different forms. It can be empowering or it can be disempowering, and so on. So that's one thing to do. The second thing to do, it seems to me, is systematically to de-bias. We know what all those biases are of rural development tourism, for instance, which you, like me, have probably been victims of or participants in one way or another. Well, you can deliberately offset those. And in fact, there's a blog about this, about how you can deliberately offset this with an unmarked vehicle by wandering around, just meeting people and chatting in tea shops and so on, which practices which I'm sure everybody has indulged in and enjoyed. But it needs to be done systematically. Otherwise, you just get taken to the same usual places and misled through an accumulation of the same sort of information being exchanged by other people in urban centers. So that's de-biasing, and there are many other ways, I'm sure, to de-bias. And running through all of this is attitude and behavior change. And this is that our behavior has to become participatory, facilitating. We can convene, we can facilitate, and then stand back, and people do their own analysis. And there are three T words which are sometimes used, which I think are quite useful for reflection: truth, trust, and transparency. And these three go together. You trust people if they're transparent and if they're telling the truth. But if they're not transparent, you can't tell whether it's truth or not. So those three, truth, trust, and transparency, seem to me to be important. And then fourth is my conclusion, which is where we need to go from here. And this is why this is such a good springboard, this series, wonderful, because it's a question of, I would say, of searching, and obviously the organizers of this series, they have searched to find people who can fill the slots that they wanted to fill. Search and share. And beyond that, a word which occurs 2 or 3 times in the brief for this is innovate. But innovate and share what you've innovated. It's no good innovating if it just goes dead and just is limited to your own innovation. It's to share it and then to network and to learn from other people's experiences. So that's what I would say, and I'd give you just one example of that, and that is something that is developed as a methodology in India with sanitation and hygiene. And this is CLNOB, Community Leave No One Behind. And this is based on convening and facilitating people within a community to do their own analysis of the people who are poorer, worse off, and who they can help themselves. So it's a question of convening, facilitating, and then standing back and hoping, and if necessary, supporting actions taken by members of the community. It's been hindered by COVID because it was based quite largely on mapping all the households in a collective way, and then identifying those that were disabled or had other problems, the very old, and so on, and then facilitating the discussion of the community itself, or people in the community themselves, about what they can do about it. So that's a bit of sharing, and there will be a link to the website will be made available to you, which has got the guidance for CLNOB adapted for a time of COVID when you have to have social distancing, which of course makes mapping, community mapping, more difficult. So finally, congratulations to FAO and to your group within FAO and to the Belgian aid for supporting all this and for initiating it. And I'm very, very much now looking forward to listening to other people and to learning a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Chambers. Indeed, it has been absolutely fascinating, as always, to listen to you, to learn from you. And I think you gave us very clear elements to discuss, not only today, but throughout the whole webinar sessions, and of course in our day-to-day work, not least the CLNOB, that's new for me. And also, of course, if it comes from the community, we also need to see the internal biases within the community and the community members. And usually you will ask, depending on the power structures, as you told us, to look within the communities, as communities are not homogeneous. We need to address those power issues within the communities. And if you usually ask a male leader why women don't have land in that community, they will say this is the way it is and the way it should be. So again, those biases that you told us to systematically de-bias, to go through them systematically, they're also present. Not only the ones we take to the communities, but also within the community. So that's another layer of really interesting issues that we need to address. So thank you so very much. Very insightful, lots of food for thought as usual. Thank you, Professor. Now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Katherine Gibson, who is a professor of culture and society at Western Sydney University, Australia. And she's actually in Australia. So I dare not think what time it is for you now, Katherine. Over to you. Welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. And can you hear me okay? Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Good morning to all of you, and good evening to those of us who are in Asia and Australia. It's about 8:45, so I'm still awake. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak in this webinar. First of all, I'm not sure what picture of me you can see, but I hope it's the one that has the background of a beautiful river behind it. I can't see myself. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I am talking to you from the unceded territory of the Gadigal and Darug people of the Aurora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is and always will be Aboriginal land, and I'm very grateful to be able to participate in caring for this country. And second, I'd like to say how honoured I am to be following on from Robert's talk. His work on sustainable livelihoods and people-centred development has been inspirational to my own action research and that of the Community Economies collective that I am part of with people in rural communities. So in this short talk, I'd like to raise two issues. First of all is how the vision of a one world stands in the way of community empowered rural transformation. And secondly, how exploring what gender equity means to community members opens up possibilities for our challenged times. So what do I mean by that first, we're not up to that yet, but anyway, what do I mean by the one world vision? And what is it that stands in the way of community empowered rural transformation? Well, the one world, and here I'm using the words of my friend Arturo Escobar, is the one where the path to global development is seen as yoked to the growth of commodity markets, the growth of production for profit, and the growth of waged labour. It's a world where the only recognised pathway for alleviating rural poverty is to make markets work for the poor. This is the vision of development that has, over my lifespan, which is also roughly the lifespan of the FAO, given us the great acceleration. That is, the great acceleration. That is the exponential growth since the 1950s of economic output, along with the massive growth of environmental degradation, of livelihood destruction, of zoonotic pandemics, and increasing inequality. And this is just some of the graphs that Will Stephan and others have put together to show this incredible symmetry of exponential growth curves that constitute the great acceleration. This one world vision of the world rests on a business as usual model, the very model whose impacts the Sustainable Development Goals are attempting to address. Today, I think there's no question that we're living in very challenged times and that the well-being of future generations of humans and other species rests on our shoulders. Well, some 30 years ago, Robert Chambers and Gordon Conway proposed the very radical idea that poor rural people might participate in building sustainable livelihoods for themselves and their communities. And amazingly, this idea was listened to by those able to influence the development aid agenda for a while at least. The sustainable livelihoods approach to rural transformation was built on an appreciation of the immense diversity of livelihood practices that rural people were already engaged in. That is, the plurality of activities that took place on farm and off farm, across markets and non-market forms of exchange and encounter, and over local and global spheres. It was also built upon insights from ecological dynamics that highlighted how increased complexity and diversity in livelihood systems would lead to greater resilience and well-being. And what attracted me to this approach was the way in which it appeared to recognise a diverse economy. As a feminist economic geographer, and along with my late colleague, Julie Graham, I've been very interested to challenge mainstream representations of economy that ignore or downplay the contribution of women's unpaid labour, of community associations and mutual aid networks, of social enterprises and cooperatives, of non-market exchanges, and funny screen just came up, non-market exchanges and ethical markets, and so many other interactions and transactions. Building on a long tradition of feminist thought, we preferred to talk of a diverse economy. And this iceberg representation has been a simple device that we've used with communities to help people recognise that even though they might not have a formal job or produce things for sale, that is, they don't see themselves in that tip of the iceberg real economy, they still contribute to keeping our world afloat. It's also been used to show that there are many ways to create and share wealth, not only by working in a privately owned enterprise. And the diverse economy includes in this vision not only human activities, but biophysical processes that contribute to nourishing habitats. So in the Pacific, we've used a floating coconut instead of an iceberg to get the same idea across. This is an inclusive vision of economy in which everyone is an actor. The question for communities is, what kind of actions do we want to take to increase well-being? What kind of actions do we want to take to maintain nourishing habitats and to ensure that future generations of humans and other species have a chance to enjoy on this very small blue planet? As with the Sustainable Livelihoods approach, we've experimented with asset mapping with communities in rural Asia and the Pacific, and also in deindustrializing regions of Australia and the United States. And we've been particularly interested in getting people to document and value, could I have the next slide, please, their traditional practices of mutual aid, or we might call it social protection in policy speak, that have often been sidelined, if not undermined, in discourse and policy. And here I'll give you some examples of what I mean. Here are some of the terms used in the Visayas region of the Philippines to name very specific forms of community labor exchange, of community financing, and community exchange practices. And they've got particular names. There's an incredible language that we've been trying to document in Monsoon Asia of the practices that contribute to this kind of support. Many years ago, Robert talked about the underperceived dynamism of the livelihood strategies of poor people. And this underperception is something that our research has also come up against. So here we see a group of poor, single, rural women in Odisha. They're a collective of Adivasi women who work together experimenting with ecological farming. To do so, they're revitalizing traditional practices of reciprocal labor exchange. Listen to what they've told my colleague, Bhavya Chipranchi, who I think is in the audience. They've said, when we work together, the work feels so easy. It becomes difficult, both physically and psychologically, when we have no one to share it with. And here in the next slide, we see community members in North Sulawesi in Indonesia practicing what they call mapalus, building boats and clearing land and working together. It's this kind of labor that is drawn upon in the aftermath of extreme weather and disaster events, of which there are an increasing number these days with climate change. This is ethically oriented work designed to have a practical material outcome, but also, and perhaps importantly, as importantly, the community benefit of building social harmony. It's these kinds of diverse livelihood practices developed over the longue durée that contribute to resilience. They're complex. They can't always be captured when translated into the language of trade-offs between the 5 capitals. The point I'd like to make is that real community empowerment must resist the one world vision of the economy that has for too long undermined the kind of complexity that supports resilience. Community empowerment must involve listening to people in communities, bringing to visibility the ethical economic practices that contribute to well-being that they're involved in, and supporting and helping the dynamism of these practices. So let me then turn to the second issue. How might gender equity contribute to rural transformation? Well, gender equality is a very lofty and worthy universal goal, but it has to be grounded in the real experience and desires of people if it is to produce real change. So the iceberg, or the floating coconut, is a useful device to use to illustrate the differences between men's and women's lives in rural areas. When what men did and what women did over the last 24 hours or the week is recorded, the result isn't often as evenly balanced as shown here in this image. In this YouTube clip, a young Melanesian man relates the story of filling in the tasks that his mates have completed over the last few days and comparing them to those of the women in their families. And he says, "You claim your wife is just a housewife, as if she's doing nothing. But can you just imagine? She had 54 items on the list, and you did 4 or 14. This is impressive. So women deserve praise, and they should be treated as equally as men." It's these kinds of conversations that can feed into communities taking charge of defining what gender equity means for them. In action research I've conducted in Melanesia with other colleagues, and I think Katherine McKinnon is one of them who might well be in the audience, we found that people are thirsty to discuss what gender issues they're concerned about and their aspirations for change. we found that for women, there certainly is an interest in economic empowerment. But this doesn't only mean individual access to cash incomes. Importantly, it also means working with men to perform household tasks together and working collectively with other women in traditional, often non-monetized practices and transactions. It also means, importantly, gaining more voice and recognition in their community. Again, the diversity of activities was highlighted and the need to keep it complex in order to maintain resilience. Attracting women into cash production or waged work, for example, even if it were available in many parts of the Pacific, it's not, would have implications for the well-being that is created in these other spheres, particularly in the area of gardening and direct food provisioning, an activity that not only produces material benefit, but gives women considerable satisfaction and status. This is a compilation of all the sorts of indicators that people came up with in the communities we work with, that they defined as important to them as they sought to build a more resilient future. And I don't think you can read all of these things, but they're available in some of the materials I can supply later. Developing community-based indicators of gender equity with people is a generative process that will ensure that there's active engagement in rural transformation. The series of webinars that we're launching tonight or today provide a wonderful opportunity to revisit the question of what kind of empowerment and what kind of change. And I urge us to hear in this critical moment of the Great Acceleration, I urge us to hear the words of Australian eco-feminist Val Plumwood, a great friend of mine, who wrote just before she died, "If our species does not survive the ecological crisis, it will probably be due to our failure to imagine and work out new ways to live with the earth, to rework ourselves and our high energy, high consumption, and hyper-instrumental societies adaptively. We'll go onwards in a different mode of humanity or not at all," she wrote. And I invite you then, lastly, to hear the poetry of Analu, a single Adivasi woman, a member of the Economies Sangatan that Bhavya Diffranchi has been involved in Odisha, who offers some guidance for us when she says, "We in the Economies Sangatan wish to live on our land, surrounded by the forest and a river, where we would labor together to produce and share the food, look after each other, sing and dance in harmony, and where we shall be free of all our pain and misery." So I look forward to the ongoing discussions that we'll have as part of this webinar series. And these are some of the resources that I've drawn upon in this short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much indeed, Katherine Gibson, for this really insightful presentation. And I think that we've hopefully come a long way in turning away from this development model that will necessarily take us towards only markets and capitalist businesses and wage labor. I think that you gave us really good insight and not only very good clues on how to go about the future in terms of locally generated indicators of that development itself, and then specifically gender indicators of what development means, and the concept of doing things together, social harmony linked to resilience, are of course very, very important and many times just left aside by any kind of, say, mainstream development theory. So thank you so much for that presentation. Now